I'm back, and this time I'm not in my car because it is far too cold for that. We're getting a winter front currently, and so it's freezing outside, and me having wet hair doesn't help this. So we're back in my bedroom. Today I want to talk about nostalgia games. I've been thinking back a lot about my journey with video games recently, about where it started, and I kind of do this like self-reflection every time I get a little bit burnt out with video games. And I know this sounds crazy because video games are not that deep for some people, but whenever I get burnt out with video games, I kind of have to think back to where I started and be like, okay, why did you like video games in the first place? And let's just get back to that. And so for me, a lot of what I liked about video games was the story aspect of video games that it brought, but that wasn't always the case. And we're going to talk about that with some of the nostalgic games that I have played over the years in my progression of gaming. Now, the video games that I find nostalgic are obviously probably not going to be the video games that you find nostalgic. Everyone has different places where they started playing video games, especially depending on the year that you were born and the year that you even got into video games. For instance, some people might find Resident Evil 1 super nostalgic. I wasn't even born when Resident Evil 1 came out, so can't find that one nostalgic. But for me, my journey kind of really started actually with the PS2, which I just talked about. Resident Evil 1, I'm sure that was a PS2 game. I don't know, I didn't do my research on that. My journey started on a PS2. My dad was a big video game fanatic. He loved video games. He loved really any like electronic trinket that he could get his hands on. So one of the things that he passed down to us, his children, was his PS2. And I didn't have a whole lot of games for the PS2. I wasn't really asking for video games to play. I kind of just had what I was given. But there are two games that I was provided, that I was bought for the PS2 that I loved. This is where I started my video game journey. This is really the starting point of Kay being obsessed with video games. So one of the very first games that I got, I believe it's called Nickelodeon Volcano Island, or Fight for Volcano Island, or something like that. Girl, I loved this game. This was my favorite game. For the longest time, I thought that this was just a SpongeBob game, and so I kept trying to find it, like by searching up like SpongeBob video games, and it would never come up. And I finally found the disc, and I was like, oh, this is not just a SpongeBob game, this is a whole Nickelodeon game. I loved that game. I wish that I could find that disc and replay that game, or even like find like an emulator of that game, because the amount of times that I played, replayed, restarted that game is obscene for someone who was below the age of 15, and also obscene for someone who never beat this game. I don't know what happens at the end. I have no idea. I never beat this game. I would get to a hard part, I'd be like, time to restart. And that was fun for me. That was fun. One of the other kind of like nostalgic-y video games that I had on the PS2 was some Scooby-Doo games, but the one that I loved the most was Night of 100 Frights. I loved this game. Again, another game that I never finished. Every time I would get to a hard part, I'd be like, restart time. I would spend so long in the area of this map where there was an ice skating rink and like a slide and like a little zip line that sent you around. That's all I did, and I had so much fun. I hardly ever progressed this game, but I had so much fun playing this game. So those were my first like two earliest experiences with video games, which for me look very different from the video games that I play now. And I think that's just because at that age and during that age of video games, there weren't a whole lot of games that provided a good storyline, which is what I'm invested in now as an adult who plays video games. And even if there were games that had a good storyline, they weren't storylines that either one, were appropriate for me as a child, or two, that my family really wanted to buy me. Moving on from that, I did have a Nintendo phase. I think every kid around my age, and I say kid as if I'm not almost 30 years old, I'm 26. I think every kid around my age had like a Nintendo phase, just because in the early 2000s, Nintendo was booming. So I obviously had a Nintendo DS and I had a Wii, and the amount of time that me and my siblings spent on the Wii was crazy. There were 4 of us, so I can't even imagine how much playtime the Wii got. The Wii was so tired that it broke 2 separate times. We played it so much. So some of my favorite games on the Wii, we'll start there. I loved carnival games. And I loved carnival games because I liked to play with like my siblings. I was a big proponent of sibling play, which is crazy because a lot of people talk about giving their siblings like a broken controller or a controller that's not connected. No, I loved to play with my siblings. I was like, can you play with me? And I was the oldest, so this is kind of like interesting that this happened. I wanted my siblings to play with me, so there was like, I believe, a co-op version of carnival games. And if I'm like totally misremembering that, let me know. But I feel like I remember playing co-op carnival games. And really, now that I'm thinking of it, maybe I don't. So I loved carnival games, and then another thing that I really loved on the Wii was obviously Mario. And my thing was Mario Kart and Super Mario Brothers. Loved those games. Mario Kart was very obviously a multiplayer game. Loved playing with my siblings. And Super Mario Brothers, again, another multiplayer game. Loved playing with my siblings. To be so honest, yeah, we would fight over Mario Bros, but sometimes I wasn't gonna make it through a level without my little sister, you know? She carried sometimes. And I don't know if some people are gonna argue, like, can it really be a nostalgic game if they're still currently making like new iterations of these same games? And I believe so, and at least it's nostalgic for me in a way that I don't play Nintendo games really anymore. I'm not like a Nintendo girly. I know there's some people out there who are hardcore die for Nintendo, die for any of those games, any of the franchises that they make, but it's really just not me anymore. I don't really like Animal Crossing. I don't play Mario anymore. And I'm pausing because I'm like, do they really make anything else? And no. In my mind, that's the only 2 franchises that Nintendo has. So these games are nostalgic to me, even if you don't think they're technically nostalgic games, because I'm not kicking it with Nintendo no more. And then moving on to like the DS, this was where I was able to do a lot more like single player games. So for me, some of the most nostalgic games on the Nintendo DS, and I had a pink original DS, and I was so cute, and my sister had a red one. One of my favorite games on the Nintendo DS was Nintendogs. That was a great one. Another one that I think was actually kind of really weird now that I'm looking back on it, that my mother purchased for me, and that was even developed and like a popular game at the time, was the one where you could take care of a baby. If you guys know what I'm talking about, that was a weird game. But on top of that, we also played Super Mario Brothers on the Nintendo, and I loved that. One of my favorite game modes for Super Mario Brothers on the Nintendo was where you would connect with another player. So I'd connect with my sister, because that was my built-in best friend. I would connect with my sister, and there would be stars that you had to collect like around the levels, and whoever got the most stars won, or whoever got like 3 stars first won, or whatever. Loved that game mode. We spent hours in that game mode. Loved it. The only other kind of like older nostalgic games I kind of really remember for the DS is maybe like some Barbie games. I think I had like Barbie Island Princess, and I probably put a good amount of time into Barbie Island Princess. If now I'm remembering it, it's coming back to me. That was a good game. That was a good game. So that's kind of where my video game journey kind of progressed into. We went from the PS2, and then we transitioned into Nintendo, and I think we transitioned into Nintendo just because I feel like I remember them being like a cheaper option than like buying the next PS whatever, and maybe the next PS wasn't even out. Who even knows? But I also felt like it was marketed as more of like a family friendly, like get your kids a Nintendo, get your kids a Wii, you know. So I feel like that's kind of why my trajectory went from PS2 into Nintendo. And then from there, I kind of fell off of video games, right? And eventually I got back into watching people play video games. And so some of these next nostalgic games aren't even games that I originally played myself. They're games that I watched someone else play, and then later in life, when I bought my own PC, I was able to buy those games and play those games as me. So the very first game that I always go back to as my most nostalgic game is Gone Home. I love Gone Home. Gone Home. I will never shut up about Gone Home. And I know that the company is not a great company. And their most recent work that they put out, Open Roads, I don't like it, which is so disappointing. But Gone Home, What Remains of Edith Finch, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, these were all games that kind of put me on the trajectory of loving story-based video games. Something that has a story that means something to someone and that portrays some kind of message. Sometimes it doesn't even have to portray a message. Sometimes I just like the story that it's telling. And so while yes, I have these like older nostalgic video games like Nickelodeon, like Scooby-Doo, like the Super Mario Brothers, the ones that always really stick out to me are Gone Home, Edith Finch, Ethan Carter, things like this, because this is when I was starting to become more of like invested in games that I would continue to play and continue to gravitate towards throughout my adult life. And I'm sure as I get older, other games will become nostalgic. I can't wait for one day some kid is gonna rock up and be like, Grounded was my most nostalgic game. Girl, Grounded came out like 5 years ago. What are you talking about? But yeah, I can't wait for us to get kind of older, and then these like newer games that we're experiencing right now are gonna become nostalgia games. Like honestly, The Last of Us is kind of creeping up on becoming nostalgia. So I'm sure that as we progress through time, more things are going to become nostalgia that were once new and shiny now, and that's just how nostalgia and time works. But that's kind of like my journey and what my nostalgia games are. I'd love to hear what your nostalgia games are and what you kind of think of as like nostalgia. Like I said, like, is Super Mario Bros. Like considered nostalgia for you because that's such an ongoing like franchise, or do you think that it doesn't really fit that category? So definitely let me know. I always like to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments. So I guess we'll see what becomes nostalgia in the next 5-10 years. Who knows? Maybe I'll still be on YouTube by then.